The parking garage under Kensington Tower was empty except for the hum of a dying fluorescent light and the sound of Mara Delgado's own heartbeat in her ears. A black SUV idled across the 2 exit lanes, engine running, headlights off. She pulled her phone from her pocket on instinct, no signal, not one bar, the way it never was on this level, and realized in the same breath that the stairwell door behind her, the one she always kept unlocked as a backup exit, had been propped shut with something wedged against the crash bar. Both ways out, gone, in the space of 2 seconds. She had her keys laced between her fingers before she even decided to reach for them, an old habit from months of practicing exactly this. A man stepped out of the passenger side, unhurried, smiling the smile of someone who already believed he owned the next 5 minutes of her life. "We just want to talk, Mara," he said, and the sound of her real name in his mouth hit her harder than a slap. That was when the cleaner's cart came rattling around the concrete pillar behind her. He was nobody, just a man in a faded polo with a mop bucket and a badge that read Jonah Merrick, the kind of person the man in the grey jacket didn't bother looking at twice. "Building's closing up, sir," Jonah said quietly, not quite meeting anyone's eyes, the posture of a man who had spent his whole life being told to keep his head down. The man in the grey jacket laughed, an easy, contemptuous sound. "Walk away, old man. This isn't your business." Jonah lowered his eyes further, exactly the way he was supposed to. What the man never saw was the way Jonah's hand tightened slowly around the mop handle, knuckles going pale, or the way his eyes, for 1/2 second, stopped being afraid at all. What that man didn't know, what almost no one in Kensington Tower knew, was that the cleaner they were laughing at owned the entire building. Stay close, because before this night is over, the men hunting Mara Delgado are going to learn exactly who they picked a fight with. 8 months earlier, none of this existed yet. Ethan Cole was still Ethan Cole, founder and, until recently, CEO of Halcyon Dynamics, one of the 5 largest technology companies in the country, a man whose product sat in nearly every American home even though almost nobody could have picked his face out of a crowd. He had built that anonymity on purpose over 2 decades, letting the product speak while he stayed buried in server rooms and spreadsheets. It had served him well right up until the morning it didn't. The vote happened on the 38th floor, in a room with a view Ethan had once been proud of. Desmond Cray, Halcyon's chief operating officer, stood at the head of the table with the kind of composure that only comes from months of rehearsal, laying out numbers that made Ethan's instincts look like liabilities. Renata Sorrell, the board chair, said almost nothing, which was somehow worse than if she'd argued, because her silence meant the outcome had already been decided before Ethan walked in. The vote to strip him of operational control passed by a margin so thin it should have insulted both sides. Nobody clapped. Nobody looked at him. Ethan gathered his folder, said nothing, and walked out of a company he'd built with his own hands into a hallway that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. He didn't call his lawyers that night. He sat alone in his apartment with the television off and realized, with a kind of quiet horror, that he could not remember the last ordinary day he'd had, a day where nobody needed a decision from him and no headline was circling his name. So he did something no one on his legal team would ever have approved. He called Owen Marsh, the one man who'd protected him for 11 years without ever once asking him to explain himself, and he said, "I need to disappear for a while." Not gone. Just unseen. Owen didn't argue. He built Jonah Merrick from nothing, a lease, a bank account, a work history clean enough to survive a background check nobody was paying to run carefully. 2 weeks later, Ethan Cole reported for his first overnight shift at Kensington Tower, a building he owned through a holding structure so quiet even most of his own board didn't know he was their landlord, pushing a cart down hallways where he used to walk in tailored suits, and for the first time in longer than he could admit, he slept. He noticed Mara on his second week. She worked 2 floors below his usual rotation, moving through the building fast and quiet, finishing every task like she was trying to leave as little trace of herself as possible. Her badge said Bishop. He heard her correct herself once in a stairwell, mid-sentence on the phone, "It's Mara Del," before catching the slip and forcing it back into Bishop, her voice gone tight and careful. He noticed the way her whole body went rigid whenever a black SUV idled outside the loading dock, the way she'd force her shoulders back down a second later like she was embarrassed to have reacted at all. he told himself it wasn't his business. He had come here to disappear from complications, not collect new ones. Then came the night the delivery van backfired in the loading dock, and Mara didn't just flinch, she dropped into a half-crouch behind a cart, breathing hard, before catching herself and standing up like nothing had happened at all. Nobody else on the crew even looked over. Ethan did. And something about the speed with which she rebuilt her calm, the practiced, exhausted skill of it, reminded him of himself in the weeks after the boardroom, and he understood, watching her, that whatever she was hiding from was not an ordinary kind of scared. She started letting him walk with her to the subway some nights, never explaining why, never asking him anything real in return. It became the best part of his week without his permission. She had a dry, unexpected sense of humor she rationed carefully, usually aimed at the absurdity of a 41st floor conference room at 2 a.m., whiteboard still covered in strategy no cleaner was ever supposed to read. Somebody in there thinks synergize the vertical is a real sentence, she told him once, and Ethan laughed so hard he had to set his mop down, and for one unguarded second he forgot he was supposed to be someone else. He noticed things about her life that a person only notices if they're paying far more attention than a coworker should. Her shoes were held together with glue at the seam. She never took the elevator alone with anyone she didn't already know by name. She kept the break room's leftover coffee rather than buying her own, counted her tips into careful stacks before folding them into a rubber-banded roll she kept in her sock rather than her bag. She slept, he would later learn, with a chair wedged under her apartment doorknob every single night, a habit she'd built so early into her disappearing that she no longer noticed herself doing it. Once, when a supervisor offered the crew a transfer to a private residential contract paying nearly double, Mara read the flyer twice, then quietly threw it away, and Ethan noticed the flyer had only been posted on the floor she cleaned. Other members of the crew rolled their eyes at her sometimes, the way people do at coworkers they've decided are a lot, the girl who wouldn't ride the freight elevator alone, who flinched at slamming doors, who always seemed to be watching the exits instead of watching the television mounted in the break room. Nobody asked why. Ethan started to understand that being dismissed as dramatic was its own kind of exhausting violence, a second wound layered quietly over the first, and he found himself furious on her behalf in a way that surprised him, a founder who had spent 2 decades keeping his temper locked behind boardroom composure suddenly wanting, badly, to say something to a room full of people who couldn't be bothered to wonder what had made a 29-year-old woman so afraid of an elevator. It was on one of those quiet nights, the break room empty except for the hum of a vending machine, that Mara said something she hadn't planned to say out loud. She was turning a paper cup slowly between her hands, not looking at him. "Sometimes I forget what my real name even sounds like anymore," she said. "Like it belongs to somebody I used to know instead of somebody I am." She laughed a little, embarrassed, like she'd said too much, and added, "You're the only person in this building who makes me feel like I'm not crazy." Jonah wanted, more than he had wanted almost anything in the last 2 decades, to tell her the truth right there, that he understood exactly what it cost to answer to a name that wasn't fully your own, that he knew precisely what it felt like to watch people mistake the mask for the man. He opened his mouth once and closed it again, because the truth would have unraveled everything Owen had built to keep her safe, and he told himself that was the only reason he stayed silent. It wasn't the only reason. He simply wasn't ready yet to lose the version of himself she trusted. The night everything changed started with an empty timecard slot. Mara hadn't clocked in. Ethan stood in front of the schedule board for 10 full seconds without moving, staring at the blank space next to her name the way he used to stare at a collapsing stock chart, some old animal part of him already understanding this wasn't nothing. He told himself she'd called in sick. He told himself that twice more before he stopped believing it. He called Owen from a payphone 2 blocks from his apartment, old habits dying hard even now. "I need everything you can find on a woman named Mara Delgado," he said. Quietly. Owen called back 2 days later, and his voice had the flatness he only used when something had moved from concerning to serious. Mara Delgado, 29, had worked until 8 months ago as a junior compliance analyst at Ashgrove Freight Solutions, a mid-sized logistics firm, until a federal inquiry into its shipping manifests opened and then, mysteriously, stalled. Since then she'd lived under 2 different last names in 3 different apartments. Then Owen paused, and the pause went on a beat too long. "Ethan," he said. "There's something else." "What?" Ash Grove wasn't just connected to Halcyon. Silence. Halcyon owned it. 6 years ago. One of your acquisitions. Ethan sat very still in his kitchen, the phone against his ear, and felt something in his chest go cold and quiet at once. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice came out smaller than he expected. "My company gave them the roads they used to hunt her," he said, to no one, because Owen had already gone quiet on the other end, letting him sit with it. He didn't go home after that call. He went back to Kensington Tower in the middle of the night, let himself into the utility closet on the 12th floor where the cleaning crew kept its supplies, and sat down on an overturned bucket still wearing Jonah Merrick's uniform. The Halcyon logo was stamped discreetly into the building directory bolted to the wall across from him, small and silver, something he'd never once looked at twice until that night. Somewhere in the 6 years since Halcyon had absorbed Ash Grove into its logistics division, a division head he'd trusted and barely thought about again had signed off on an acquisition that gave Faro exactly the infrastructure it needed to move people the way it moved freight. Ethan had approved the original expansion strategy himself. He had sat in a boardroom once, celebrating that deal, congratulating a team for growth numbers, while somewhere down the corporate chain a woman named Mara Delgado was learning, in the worst way possible, exactly what his company's growth had cost her. He didn't cry, not exactly. He put his head back against the cold cinderblock wall and stayed there until the small window above him started going grey with morning, turning one sentence over and over until it stopped sounding like an excuse and started sounding like a fact he had to live inside. "My empire got so big I couldn't see who it was crushing. Nobody found him there. Nobody was supposed to. That was, after all, the entire point of Jonah Merrick." What Owen's people found over the following 2 weeks was uglier than either of them wanted. Ash Grove's manifests, legitimate freight on paper, had for years quietly moved something else through falsified routes, a trafficking pipeline run by a network calling itself Faro, with enough laundered money and enough friends in the right offices to buy silence at nearly every level it needed. Mara had found the irregularities during a routine audit, numbers that made no sense for what they claimed to carry, and reported it exactly once to a compliance director who, Owen's research strongly suggested, had been paid to make problems like Mara disappear from the paperwork long before they disappeared any other way. Within a month, her apartment had been broken into. Nothing stolen. She'd come home to find her top drawer open, her mother's photograph turned face down on the dresser, untouched otherwise, which was somehow worse than if they'd taken everything, because it told her the message wasn't about property. It was about her. Her mechanic had gone quiet checking her brakes a week later, wiped his hands on a rag, and said only, "Miss, don't drive this car again." She'd gone to the police once, sat across a metal desk in a precinct that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and told a detective named Weller everything, the break-in, the brakes, the audit numbers she still had saved on a flash drive in her coat pocket. Weller had listened for exactly 4 minutes, tapping his pen against the folder the entire time, and asked her once, almost gently, whether she'd been under any unusual stress at work lately. She said no. He wrote something down anyway. When she finished, he closed the folder with a soft, final sound that told her everything before he even opened his mouth. "Maybe you're imagining things," he said. "People get jumpy. Not cruel. Almost kind." Which was somehow worse, because kindness made it easier to believe him, easier to wonder, for one terrible half-second, if he was right and she really had lost her grip on what was real. She sat in the precinct parking lot afterward and cried for the first time since it all started, both hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, watching Detective Weller's window on the 2nd floor through the windshield, wondering if he was already picking up a phone. Then she drove straight to a motel 40 minutes outside the city, checked in under a name she made up standing at the counter, paid cash, and never used the name Delgado in public again. She never called her mother to explain. She picked up the phone twice, dialed for digits, and hung up both times, because the only thing worse than disappearing alone was the thought of dragging someone she loved into the same danger. Ethan learned all of it in pieces over those 2 weeks, and every piece cracked something further open in him. He started watching for what he now understood to be evidence rather than coincidence, a man in a grey jacket asking the bodega cashier near Mara's subway stop if she recognized a photo on his phone, the cashier's blank, practiced headshake. A second flyer for the same private residential contract, posted exactly 1 week after Mara turned down overtime for the first time he'd ever seen. He didn't tell her any of it. He didn't know yet how to, not without unraveling Jonah Merrick completely, and some part of him, a part he would later be ashamed of, was still afraid of what would happen to whatever they had if she learned the truth too soon. That fear cost them almost everything. Mara was 2 floors down when Ethan found her cornered in the garage the first time, the scene we opened on, but that night wasn't the end of it. It was only a warning shot Ferro hadn't expected to fail. The man in the grey jacket left smiling, unhurried, the smile of someone who knew he had all the time in the world, and Ethan understood, walking Mara to the subway in silence afterward, that all the time in the world meant they were about to run out of theirs. Desmond Cray chose that same week to publicly humiliate the very disguise Ethan had been hiding behind, though he had no idea what he was actually doing. He'd come down to the 12th floor for an after-hours donor meeting, spotted Jonah wiping down a glass partition near where Mara was restocking the supply closet, and said, loudly enough for the donors behind him to hear, "Make sure those floors shine, gentlemen, that's the one thing people like you can be trusted with." A few donors laughed. On his way out, Desmond let his half-finished coffee cup drop from his fingers, splashing across the tile he'd just mocked Jonah for polishing, and nodded toward it without breaking stride. "That's yours now," he said, not even bothering to look back. Mara's jaw tightened. Jonah crouched down and wiped it up without a word, kept his eyes on the tile, and Ethan Cole, underneath that faded polo, filed the sentence away with a kind of cold, patient clarity that Desmond Cray would come to regret in exact and specific detail. What Ethan didn't learn until Owen's research went deeper was that Desmond's contempt for people like Mara wasn't new, and it wasn't limited to a hallway insult. Buried in an internal email chain from over a year earlier, before the boardroom coup, before any of it, was a forwarded compliance flag from a junior analyst at Ashgrove Freight Solutions, Mara's original report, the one that should have stopped Ferro before it ever got close to her, routed up through 2 departments and landing, briefly, in Desmond's inbox as Chief Operating Officer. His reply, for words long, still sat in the thread, "Not worth our time." He hadn't investigated. He hadn't escalated. He'd glanced at a warning that could have saved 8 months of Mara's life and decided a junior analyst's numbers weren't worth the trouble of reading twice. Ethan read that email 3 times before he could make himself close the laptop, understanding now that the man who'd mocked a cleaner in a hallway had also, a year earlier and without ever knowing her name, looked directly at the thing that would nearly destroy her and turned away from it on purpose. 10 days later, Mara didn't show up for her shift. Or the next night. On the second night, Owen called just past 1 a.m. Mara had left her apartment that evening for what looked like a legitimate interview, a staffing agency offer, overnight warehouse security, nearly double her pay, an offer that had arrived exactly when she was tired enough and scared enough of running out of money to take a risk she otherwise wouldn't have. She'd hesitated over it for 2 full days. Owen's surveillance log noted the hesitation. She'd gotten into the car at 7:40 p.m. anyway. The plates traced back to a shell company 2 degrees from Ashgrove. Ethan didn't hesitate the way Jonah Merrick would have. He dropped the mop cart in the middle of an empty 12th floor hallway. The bucket tipped. Water spread slowly across the tile, and the sound of the mop handle hitting the floor echoed down the corridor behind him as he walked out of Kensington Tower for the last time as anyone but himself. Inside the warehouse north of the city, Mara understood the truth within minutes of the loading bay door locking behind her. No supervisor. No interview. Just the man in the grey jacket and a second man who moved with the flat, unhurried efficiency of someone finishing a job rather than starting one. "We know your real name, Mara," the second man said, almost gently, and something in her chest folded in on itself at the sound of it, at how easily they'd found her again after 8 months of trying to become someone else entirely. She backed toward a stack of shipping containers, scanning for anything, any gap, any door, and found none. Her mind ran through every exit she'd ever memorized on every subway platform for the last 8 months, every trick she'd taught herself to survive exactly this, and none of it applied to a locked loading bay with 2 men between her and every door. She thought about running. She almost did, a half step toward a gap between 2 container stacks, low light, maybe wide enough, before the first man cut her off with 3 unhurried strides, close enough now that she could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket. "Don't," he said, almost bored, like her fear was an inconvenience to him rather than the entire point. She grabbed the only thing within reach, a length of loose chain hanging off the nearest container, and swung it wide enough to force both men back half a step, buying herself 3 seconds she didn't know what to do with. It wasn't enough. The second man caught her wrist mid-swing and twisted the chain out of her grip so easily it barely registered as a fight at all, and Mara understood, in the space of that one failed swing, that this was the closest she had come to disappearing in every sense of the word. She didn't know that 90 seconds away, a man she'd known only as a quiet cleaner with careful eyes was in the back of an armored vehicle, pulling zoning blueprints in real time, issuing instructions in a voice that carried no resemblance to Jonah Merrick's whatsoever. Owen's team breached a side maintenance door 11 minutes after Mara's car had arrived. Ethan came in behind them, unarmed, moving faster than his body had moved in years, and found her exactly where his gut told him she'd be, back against cold metal, the 2 men closing the distance with the patience of men who believed they'd already won. He called out. Not Jonah. Not any name at all. Just enough sound to steal a half second, which was all Owen's team needed. What followed lasted under 2 minutes and felt, to Mara, like watching her own life happen from somewhere outside her body. 1 man went down before he'd fully turned. Ethan crossed the last stretch of concrete and put himself between Mara and the second man, an instinct he didn't know he still had until it was already done. The second man reached for something inside his jacket, and Owen closed that gap half a second before it mattered, and then, all at once, the warehouse went terribly, completely silent. Mara stared at Jonah Merrick standing between her and 4 armed men who clearly answered to him without question. Not at the men on the ground. Not at the guns being holstered. At him. "Who are you?" she said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, almost angry, like she already suspected the answer was going to cost her something. Ethan didn't soften it. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said. "I own this building. I own the company that used to own the one that hurt you." He hesitated, and for the first time in 8 weeks, Jonah Merrick's careful calm cracked wide open. "I didn't come here tonight to save my company. I came because you were missing." She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She stood very still, arms wrapped around herself, and said the only thing that actually mattered to her in that moment. "You were the only person I thought wasn't lying to me." It landed harder than anything Pharaoh's men had said to her all night. Ethan had no answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse, so he gave her the truth instead. "I became Jonah to hide from my own life," he said quietly. "I didn't know my life was the reason yours got destroyed." He didn't reach for her. He let the distance sit between them, because he understood, finally, fully, that being saved by someone and being lied to by the same someone could exist in the same body at the same time, and Mara needed room to feel both without him rushing her past either one. She let Owen's team take her somewhere secure that night. She didn't speak to Ethan again for 4 days. Those 4 days were the hardest of the whole 8 months for him, worse in some ways than the boardroom vote, because at least the boardroom had never pretended to love him. He spent them building the case that would finish what the warehouse started, not to win her back, he told himself, though it was a lie he barely believed even as he thought it. Owen's research connected the last thread. A shell entity funneling Pharaoh's laundered money had made 2 contributions, carefully structured to dodge disclosure thresholds, to a political fund chaired personally by Desmond Cray. Whether Desmond had known exactly what he was taking, or simply hadn't asked, Ethan intended to make certain the whole country found out either way. He called an emergency board session for the following week. He did not walk in wearing a suit. He walked in wearing the faded polo, the badge that still read Jonah Merrick clipped crookedly to his collar, and pushed a cleaning cart through the doors of the 38th floor boardroom while 11 board members stared in confused silence. Desmond Cray, mid-sentence in some unrelated agenda item, looked up and laughed, the same easy contempt from the 12th floor. "Can this wait?" he said. "We're in a meeting." Ethan said nothing. He walked to the head of the table, set a folder down beside Desmond's laptop, and reached up to unclip the badge from his collar. The room went silent in a way boardrooms rarely do. Renata Sorrell's face changed first. "Ethan," she said, the word coming out smaller than anything she'd said in 3 years of chairing that table. "You didn't recognize the man who built this company," Ethan said, laying the folder open in front of Desmond with 2 fingers. "That explains exactly how you missed the criminals sitting inside it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked the room through the trail Owen's team had built, Ashgrove, Pharaoh, the Shell contributions, the compromised detective, and then, last, he read the 4 words out loud from a year-old email thread projected onto the boardroom screen behind him. "Not worth our time." He let the silence that followed sit exactly as long as it needed to. "That was Mara Delgado's original compliance report," he said. "The one that could have stopped this before it started. You had it in your inbox 14 months ago, Desmond, and you decided a junior analyst wasn't worth reading twice." 2 of the donors from the 12th floor meeting were seated near the back of the room that morning, invited weeks earlier for an unrelated presentation, neither of them expected to become the scene of Desmond Cray's public unraveling, the same men who had watched him drop a coffee cup at Jonah's feet and call it his job. Ethan didn't point them out. He didn't have to. He simply let them watch Desmond's careful polish disappear off his face in real time, the same men who had laughed at a cleaner's uniform now watching that cleaner take the company apart with 4 words on a screen, and watched Renata Sorrell go pale and silent and then, within the hour, hand in her resignation before anyone could vote to demand it. Desmond didn't have a defense so much as a collapse. He tried, briefly, to claim ignorance, that he'd never asked where certain donations came from because a man in his position wasn't supposed to have to ask. Ethan let him finish. Then he said the only thing he needed to say. "The man you mocked for mopping floors owns the floor you're standing on. And he's about to own the story the federal investigators tell about you, too." Desmond resigned before the board could remove him. The rest came fast. Ashgrove's inquiry reopened within days, Detective Weller's file joining a wider corruption case that would eventually cost him his badge, Pharaoh's Shell infrastructure collapsing once its financial oxygen and its protected police contact were both gone inside the same month. But Ethan understood, because Mara had taught him this without meaning to, that if this story ended with him as the only one who fixed it, it wasn't finished being fair to her. So when the federal hearing convened 3 weeks later, he made one call to make sure of something specific, that Mara Delgado testified not as a victim being protected, but as the compliance analyst who found the irregularity first, whose numbers had been right for 8 months while everyone paid to ignore her told her she was imagining things. She stood in front of investigators in a plain grey blazer, her hand steady on a stack of the same shipment records she'd first flagged nearly a year earlier, and walked them through exactly what she'd seen, exactly when, exactly who she'd reported it to and what had happened to her afterward. Near the end, the lead investigator looked up from her notes and asked the question that would end up defining the whole hearing. "Miss Delgado," she said, "who first discovered the irregularities in these manifests?" Mara didn't hesitate. "I did," she said. She let it sit for a second, then added, quieter but no less steady, "and nobody believed me." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something true and simple lands harder than anything complicated could. Nobody had needed to say Pharaoh, or Ashgrove, or Halcyon, or Desmond Cray's name at all for that sentence to close the case. It was her testimony, not Ethan's fortune, that closed the final gap in the federal case against Pharaoh's network. She left that hearing not as someone who'd been rescued, but as the woman who ended them. She didn't go back to Kensington Tower for 3 weeks after that. Ethan didn't push. He understood now, better than he understood most things, that trust rebuilt too fast wasn't trust at all. He visited her apartment once during that stretch, at her invitation, carrying nothing more significant than take-out containers neither of them ended up finishing. He noticed, setting the bag down, that the chair she used to wedge under the doorknob every night was pushed back against the wall instead, unused, gathering dust along one leg. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't have to. Mara caught him noticing anyway and said, quietly, almost surprised at herself, I slept without it last night. First time in 8 months. Neither of them made it into a bigger moment than it needed to be. Some victories are loud enough on their own. It was Mara who came to him, eventually, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, standing at the entrance to Kensington Tower under her own name for the first time in 8 months. The guard at the desk asked for her ID, an unremarkable, routine request, and Mara froze for 3 full seconds before handing it over, because for the better part of a year hearing her own name out loud had meant danger, not identity. Ethan, waiting near the elevator bank, saw her hesitate and understood exactly why. You don't have to hide anymore, he said quietly. I know, Mara said. I just forgot what it felt like not to. They didn't rush anything after that. She took a compliance position at Halcyon on her own qualifications, after making him promise twice it wasn't a favor, and it wasn't. Her record from Ashgrove, once buried, now spoke for itself. Some months later, walking through the marble lobby together on an ordinary afternoon, Mara stopped near the freight elevator, the same one Jonah Merrick had once pushed a cleaning cart past her through, back when neither of them knew what the other was running from. Why do you still have that? She asked, nodding toward the small framed badge on the wall of his office they'd passed earlier, Jonah Merrick, laminated, slightly crooked in its frame. Because Jonah was the first version of me who saw what my company had stopped seeing, Ethan said. Mara reached into her bag and set something small on the shelf beside it, a second, cheaper badge, the plastic edge worn soft from months in her pocket. Mara Bishop. Then let's never become those people again, she said. Neither of them performed anything for the lobby full of employees watching them pass. There was no contract left to honor, no cover left to maintain, only 2 people who had begun as strangers hiding from very different kinds of danger, who chose, in the end, not to disappear from each other at all. Desmond Cray's name came up once more, months later, in a single line buried in a financial newspaper neither of them would have noticed if a colleague hadn't mentioned it, a settlement, a fine, a career that would never again come near a boardroom. Mara read it standing in the break room where she used to hoard leftover coffee, and felt nothing sharp about it at all, which surprised her more than anger would have. She folded the paper closed and went back to work. Some victories, she was learning, didn't need to be felt loudly to be real. Renata Sorrell sent a handwritten letter to Ethan's office that same month, 3 lines long, apologizing for a mistake she said she'd spend the rest of her career trying to understand. Ethan read it twice, and instead of writing back, he asked his assistant to route her the transcript of Mara's federal testimony instead, no note attached. He never heard from Renata again, and he decided that was answer enough for both of them. Owen Marsh, watching from the security desk the afternoon Mara set her old badge down beside Jonah's, allowed himself something close to a smile, the kind he rarely let anyone see. He'd built Jonah Merrick to give a burnt-out founder a few months of ordinary peace, nothing more ambitious than that. He never imagined it would end with a trafficking network dismantled, a boardroom overturned, a corrupt detective stripped of his badge, and the woman his boss quietly, recklessly fell for standing in that lobby under her own real name, for good, no chair wedged under any doorknob tonight. She still checks the exits sometimes. Old habits leave slowly, and Ethan has stopped expecting them to leave all at once. But she rides the elevator alone now without her shoulders going rigid. She says her own name out loud to strangers without the half-second flinch that used to follow it. And some nights, long after the office towers around Kensington Tower have gone dark, Ethan finds her standing at the window of what used to be a mop closet on the 12th floor, the one he sat in that first terrible night, now converted, at her request, into a small, unremarkable meeting room where new compliance hires get their orientation. A brass plaque by the door reads nothing but a date. Neither of them has ever needed to explain to anyone what it means. If the story of Ethan and Mara reminded you that the person mopping the floor beside you might be carrying more strength than anyone in the room realizes, and that the quietest person in the room might be the one who ends up saving it, share this with someone who has ever been ignored, underestimated, or forced to hide just to survive. And stay close, because the next story is already waiting.